First, can I thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's, I think about 10 years ago or so that I spoke in Dublin, and I was reminded of that by somebody, and I then argued that there was bound to be a crisis of capitalism shortly. Well, obviously I was proved correct eventually, or fairly quickly in fact. But at the time, I think people thought I was mad. It wasn't difficult, it isn't difficult to see why, in my view at least. What has been crucial in maintaining the stability of capitalism, and in the early period of the post-war period, this was commonly held, was in fact the Cold War itself. Or in other words, what people have called military Keynesianism. And I don't think there's any doubt of its importance. And one would expect that once it came to an end, there would be a problem. So in other words, what I'm saying is we are in a structural crisis of capitalism. And not just a structural crisis of capitalism, a crisis of strategy of capitalism as well. It's not usual when talking about a crisis of capitalism to talk of strategy. It's usually when Marxists talk of crises of capitalism, they go back to the classical forms, the three classical forms of falling rate of profit, underconsumption, and disproportionality, and then automatically work out from there. But in my view, that doesn't make sense. We don't live in that kind of capitalism. It's not an automatic capitalism of that kind as it was in the 19th, early 20th century. It's quite clear that governments, administrations play crucial roles in the economy. One can't simply leave them out as if they don't exist. And those governments are not ruled by workers. Effectively, it's a section of the ruling class which is carrying out its strategy. So one has to understand the strategy. And the strategy isn't a national strategy, it is a global strategy. Claire, in effect, discussed this when she talked of a strike by capital. I'm not certain I'll use that word, strike by capital, but I think there's something right in what she's referring to. If the way it's put, in that way, a strike by capital would appear to be a voluntary act. I don't think that is the case. I think what you've got, what we had, was an historical period in which capital couldn't control the working class, they say in the 60s and 70s, which you had considerable battles, as we all know. Now, one can explain the action of the capitalist class in switching to finance capital, which is what happened as a strategy. You can explain it in a number of ways. Claire's effectively explained it by talking of a strike by capital. And then when they talk of a drop in the rate of profit. Some people, of course, talk about the falling rate of profit owing to a rising organic composition of capital. Well, at one level it doesn't make any difference because it's clear that there was a switch. But at another level it does make a difference because we have to understand the present. And if we look at the present, it's very hard to argue that the downturn was due to a decline in the rate of profit, when so obviously the rate of profit rose. And you have to really go through contortions in order to argue that one. Now I know quite a few people have done that, and that is the orthodox view of the left. But if you try and think it out, it doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make much empirical sense, of course. But the only way you can actually argue it is actually to leave out the question of unproductive expenditure. In other words, when one looks at the graph, people producing this thing, then they deduct unproductive expenditure. Well, why? That is part of surplus value. It can't be removed. If anything, you probably have a rising rate of profit in the recent period. Well, that conforms to reality. We know the rate of profit in the United States, even now, is around 12%, the official rate of profit. That's to say, not calculated by Marxists in Marxist terms. But there's not much else you can do. I don't go along with those people who say you can work out exactly what value is given prices. I think that attempt by what I'll call the quantitative Marxists is itself pretty dubious. Well, various people argue that, and I just don't go along with it. I don't think it's possible, most particularly because you don't know what value is for productive and unproductive items. On top of which, if you think about it, not only do we not know what the profits are, the income tax inspectors, the firms themselves often don't know what their real profits are. Well, we know that. We know the way in which various firms have been taken to court. We know what part of the reason for the downturn was. Sorry. It had to do with finance capital and the way in which finance capital itself was financed. So it is actually very difficult for anybody who is a Marxist to work out real value terms. I'd say it's actually impossible unless you have a very large sum of money or a state of your own to be able to work it out. Anyway, that's to deal with one particular viewpoint, which I think has become a fetish. That's to say, simply say, look, we have a declining rate of profit, rising organic composition of capital, that's the beginning and end of it. I would agree, since I support the labour theory of value, I think anybody who's a Marxist has to do so, that you have to base yourself on abstract labour, the contradiction between abstract and concrete labour, otherwise you aren't a Marxist and you're not discussing anything. As a Marxist, that is. But all that means is that there's a limit, and you have to be able to work it out in reality. It's interesting, of course, to kind of finish this aspect of it, that the question of the falling rate of profit being determined and only became dominant in the 70s. That Trotsky, Lenin, Luxemburg, and so forth, and all Marxists in that period didn't go along with it, isn't some kind of accident. Now, the problem with it, quite apart from the fact I said it must operate as it follows, and it does exist, and it must operate if you support the labour theory of value, because if you assume a rising organic composition of capital, it will follow. But it doesn't follow at any one time or over a period of time. You would have to know the empirical reality and be able to work it out. Now, what is wrong, apart from what I just said, is that much of the argument which has taken place has ignored the class relation as a result. And what I've just been trying to say in order to get here, as it were, is that one has to look at that class relation. One has to look at the strategy of the capitalist class and see what it is in order to understand the nature of crisis itself. And that feeds into the political economy, or the three aspects which I talked about. And unless one does, it seems to me, you do produce a fetishized form of discussion within Marxism. Well, to go back to what I began with, what that means to me is that the ruling class did decide that the best way to raise profits was simply to maintain the stability of capitalism, not necessarily to raise profits. Simply maintain the stability of capitalism was to switch from industrial capital to finance capital. So it wasn't a question of a strike, as it were. It was a deliberate decision to maintain the stability of capitalism. But just consider, if I'm right at all, it also follows that they can't change that today, unless they're going to revert to industrial capitalism. Now, we know that they're talking of it, but they're only talking of it. Obama talked of it in 2008, but he hasn't implemented it. It's certainly not been implemented in Britain, and it's not likely to be. So, once consider why, and the obvious reason is the reason I gave for them switching. They can't do it. If they were to do it, they'd be back to the struggles of the 60s and 70s. in the United Kingdom, you have something like 20% unemployment, real unemployment. Before the Conservatives came in, they made quite a lot of the fact there's something like 8 million people are unemployed in Britain. There's 2.5 million officially unemployed, roughly close to 3 million who are so-called disabled, and then 2 or 3 million people who are not on the rolls of the unemployed but are unemployed. So you have a high percentage of unemployed. Obviously, it does act as a means of control. Although I don't think they fully re-established the Reserve Army of Labour, it nonetheless does act as a means of control, and you're not likely to get a repeat very easily of, or didn't have the repeat of the 60s and 70s. What they don't want to do is to reflate. Throughout this whole period, they haven't reflated. From the late 70s down to the present, they have not reflated. They consciously do not want to do it. They're afraid of the stability of the system. What that means in relation to what Claire said is that there isn't a choice. They don't really have a choice. And you cannot actually go to the population and say, let's nationalize this or that, or let's go for worse control over this or that. To the capitalist class, that will be the same thing as a declaration of war. They are very clear about that. They are not going to accept it. It would make more sense to go straight to the working class and stand for socialism. From the point of view of the ruling class, it would be the same thing, except at least you would be better prepared if you do that. It does seem to me that is the only option which is actually there. The second reason for that, why that really is the only option, is that Claire referred to the various problems of nationalised industries in passing, but said that was okay, as it were. That isn't what one wants. One wants workers' control instead, and so forth. But it's more than that. In a capitalist society, the social democratic concessions make capitalism malfunction. When they say that it malfunctions as a result, they're absolutely right. It does malfunction as a result. Capitalism does require competition and not nationalized industries or single industries. It does require competition. It does require a reserved army of labor. It does require commodity federalism. If you break any of them, capitalism will malfunction. It will function badly. When they say that, they're absolutely right. It's true. It's not an accident that you've got in the Financial Times, in the next column, a statement in which whoever writes, the three people who write it or whatever, say, referring to the new version of the film Wall Street, they say, this version of Wall Street, the movie, says greed is good. We say greed is good. That is the basis of capitalism, they say. Well, no doubt they've been half humorous, although it doesn't appear to be humorous in the way they write it. Well, it's true, accumulate. That is the nature of capitalism, the need to accumulate. However, of course, the way they put it is a moral way. So they say greed is good and fear is good. Now, the point of me saying this is that I think that underlying their strategy at the present time is precisely that. Or to go further, I haven't actually gone into the downturn, but I'll go back to it. What I want to do now is briefly go into their strategy at the present time, because it's kind of more interesting, since many people have talked about the downturn. But obviously, in my view, the downturn is somewhat different from the usual stuff. However, we've heard about the Keynesian alternative. Claire's talked about it, and other people on the floor have talked about it. Well, the fact is the Keynesian alternative is not an alternative at all. Well, of course, I've just been saying that. The ruling class doesn't actually want it. It's not prepared to do it. However, you just consider the measures that have been talked about. As I pointed out, the United States, although they have said they will build railways, they haven't done it. They haven't got there, haven't got near there. In fact, the Scientific American managed to point out that their idea of building a railway was a railway running at speeds which apply nowhere in Europe. They're so low. Some people have been talking about the United States, particularly in California, of high-speed trains. But that isn't the plan. That wasn't the original plan in trying to raise the level of economic activity in the United States as put forward by Obama. It was actually for a backward form of rail transport. That's no kind of accident, as I'm pointing out. They're not interested in actually doing it in the way one would expect them to do, if you were simply talking of reindustrialization, as it were. So the state isn't going there. Well, we know that it isn't going there because there's another downturn, or the economy is going very slow, or whatever else you want to say. It simply isn't rising in the United States. Even the upturn, the cyclical upturn which you get is very, very weak. So we know it's not working, so they aren't doing it. So, in other words, the kind of stuff that Paul Krugman talks about just isn't being implemented. Even Paul Krugman, after all, is not only not a Marxist, he isn't that left-wing either. So even he, who has said, well, this is far too little, isn't actually getting anywhere, or they aren't actually even taking what he's saying. So they just aren't doing it. Or putting it another way, they are not going to implement the Keynesian remedies. It isn't on the cards. It just isn't going to happen. It hasn't happened. Well, again, you'd expect that. After all, what's the Republican Party saying? It's saying no. Conservative Party is saying the same. Merkel's saying the same. That is now, talking of strategy, the general strategy to wind down, as it were. That is the strategy of the ruling class at the present time. And what I'm now trying to say is that although it may look absurd and crazy, and indeed, from one angle, the Conservative strategy in Britain, and for that matter in Ireland, is crazy because it can't be successful in the end. Obviously, it didn't work here. It won't work in the United Kingdom either. So looked at from that point of view, one could say it's crazy. It's also crazy from the obvious point of view that you are going to get in Britain, you would expect, a similar demonstrations to those in France eventually. And you would expect something similar in Ireland too. So from that point of view, it may look crazy. However, at least what they are doing, I mean, from their point of view, looking at it from the point of view of the capitalist class, at least what they are saying is, well, look, the Keynesian thing we cannot implement, and it is, and so far as we're doing it, it isn't working. So we won't do that. Much rather go back to the essence of capitalism. That's why I was talking about greed is good and why Financial Times Lex column could actually say that. Let's go back to the essence of capitalism. Let's go back to mass unemployment, to a situation where benefits are reduced, where people virtually have to go back into the workhouse. They are forced to work. Now, it's cruel and it's vicious, but this looks like what they're quite serious about. When you refer to a civil servant saying people have to know their place, that's part of the same thing. This may seem fantastic, but that does seem to be what they are saying. And looked at from a point of view of the stability of capitalism, it does make sense if you can ever get there. It does appear to be a real alternative. In fact, the Keynesian strategy isn't a strategy at all, really. In the end, if they do reflate, they'll be forced along the road further and further, or they'll have to retreat. So they aren't going to do it. Therefore, from the point of view of the ruling class, it does make sense for them to go along the way they are, and if they get defeated, they get defeated. It's understandable if one wants to try and understand it. As I say, looked at, as it were, from the outside or whatever, or looked at from the point of view of a socialist, it is ultimately crazy because most socialists, and certainly, as far as I'm concerned, I'm an optimist. I don't think the ruling class can succeed in this. But that does seem to be their strategy. Well, so what I've been saying is they had a strategy, the strategy of finance capital. It did work. There was a shift of capital into finance capital. They did use a particular political form, which people call neoliberal. I don't think it's liberal, neoliberal. I think it's simply the strategy of finance capital. It did squeeze industry. There was a transfer of capital from industry to finance capital. It did mean in the United States, though less so in some ways in Britain, but the standard of living in Britain did actually rise. The United States standard of living was static or actually declining for 3/4 of the population in 1973. It did mean a shift from labour to capital. I don't think anybody disputes that. That's standard. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to talk about a declining rate of profit. Of course, it meant that the workforce was stressed out, whether they were teachers or sheet metal workers. It had its own costs, as it were. It did mean that within industry, the individual management adopted views which many considered completely wrong, and of course did lead to inferior forms of working, which you would expect, obviously. If what you do is consider your whole workforce, mark them, fire the bottom 10%, reward the top 10%, and so forth, you are going to get most people hating you. And whether they work or not is up to the gods. It isn't the way to run industry, but that is the way they were running industry. Read the Financial Times, time and again they would more or less say that this is wrong, we have to have a more decent way of running industry kind of thing. But that is the way they ran industry. And of course what it meant with finance capital was that they ruined industry often enough. I don't know if anybody's read Barbarians at the Gate, but it's well worth reading. I believe it's what they say on the blurb on Barbarians at the Gate, that it's used in management courses. No, there's no one heard it. Well, it's a story by two journalists who are in no way left-wing of how what would now be called private equity took over the 19th biggest firm in the United States in the period of 1988 to 90. And what it describes is a firm. It was RJR Nabisco, which was both tobacco and biscuits. And what it describes is the way the management really simply rewarded themselves at enormous levels, didn't really care very much as long as they made lots of money, flew around the United States, had a special luxurious hangar from their fleet of aeroplanes. This is an industrial firm, not a finance capitalist firm. But of course, finance capital altered the nature of the industrial capital. And eventually, the management decided to take over the firm themselves. So then there was a fight over the thing. They describe the nature of finance capital in this. Of course, what it does is destroy the firm. Now, of course, that is the nature of finance capital. That is, finance capital is short-termist, or as Hillel Ticktin describes it, it's abstract capital. Let's say it's not confined to any particular area, place, or people. It can shift very quickly. Being short-termist is only interested in immediate profits. It does exactly what the previous speaker was talking about, MM-, but there's no intermediate anything, just MM-. Now, unlike previous speaker, I don't think money can make money. I think that's absurd. If I have a £5 note, it can't make another £5 note. You have to have abstract labour. There is no other way around it. So what it effectively did was to bleed industry. Of course, that's one of the major complaints in Britain, or for that matter in this country, or the United States. That is what it did. Well, if we actually look at some of the statistics, you see that the move into finance capital meant something like, by 2008, there was something like there was exactly $683 trillion in derivatives. $683 trillion. Now, any idiot would see that that would explode. Because, of course, even if you're only talking about real insurance, the chances are that something will go wrong. Even if there hadn't been subprime mortgages, given what you're talking about is a whole series of bets, it would be bound to explode. Anybody could see that. So what was surprising, therefore, that Buffett, although he himself is very much now involved with it, declared in 2002 that these were financial instruments of mass destruction. It was obvious, anybody could see it, that would happen. Behind that was something else. Simply held in banks, there was something like $18 trillion, simply held in banks by the rich, so-called high net worth individuals, or ultra high worth net individuals, so-called, over the world, which of course would include Ireland. But in general, they preferred banks like UBS in Switzerland, where you didn't have to pay taxes. You had another $110 trillion, which insurance companies, pension funds, private equity, and so forth had to invest. Well, you just think about it. Where were they going to invest? Well, where? It's still true. The figure now, or end of last year, for derivatives was $614 trillion. And if you look at the figures in terms of the amounts held, they're not that different. They've gone down a bit and gone up a bit. Where's it going to be invested? Where's the industry? Where? The capitalist class is not going to invest somewhere where it's going to lose money. It's not going to put it in Ireland, it's not going to put it in Greece. From that point of view, it's clear the position in Ireland can only get worse. So, where are they going to put it? Well, you've just seen that in Britain, having announced cuts, you've had a flood of money going into Britain. Well, again, that was said even before they did the cuts. People referred to Financial Times. Claire referred to the Financial Times to Martin Wolf. It's absolutely true. Martin Wolf has been saying these cuts are quite unnecessary. The money will come anyway. It's quite true. It's quite true. It would come anyway. But not just Martin Wolf. Sam Britton, after all, his brother was in the Conservative cabinet. It's pretty conservative. Has been even much stronger than Martin Wolf, deputy editor of the Financial Times. Has been saying all along, it's unnecessary. No cuts are necessary. After all, for a long period, what is it, 200-300 years in Britain, the national debt was much higher. And in fact, if you looked at the headline on Wednesday, when the cuts were done in Britain, it was Osborne heads into the unknown. In other words, the financial dime was opposed, which implies, of course, the capitalist class wasn't all that keen on the way that they actually did it. So, having said that, on the one hand, it makes sense for them to go this way, I have to then modify it by saying that the capitalist class doesn't have one viewpoint. That is clear. All I was arguing was that the Keynesian strategy isn't going to work. There's a section of the capitalist class which does actually support it. And clearly, if we look at the Conservative Party, the Republican Party in the United States, and the conservative parties in France and in Germany, they also support it. So you've got a concerted strategy, effectively, to cut and reduce the deficit with all the attendant results. But it's clear, as I said, from the Financial Times, and not just from the Financial Times, that not everybody there supports it. How much longer do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay. Well, so what it now just briefly do is two things. One is try and discuss who is in the capitalist class and what possibilities are there, as it were, as to their action. And then secondly, go back and look at the crisis. the composition of the capitalist class has changed with the switch to finance capital. It would appear, according to the Economist, as you would expect, the percentage of wealthy who come from finance capital has gone up from 2% to 20%. It's again, it's something that you would expect. The section of the capitalist class which comes from management has obviously gone up, which is what you would expect, because today we have management which is paid enormous sums. A few years ago there was one person, I think, who got a salary of 2 billion, a salary, not a capital. At the moment, I think, it's reported in the press that the CEO of Oracle gets, I think, was it 283 million salary. Well, in the United States, I think the average salary of a CEO is around 10 million. In Britain, if you look at income tax statistics, you see that 11,000 people get a salary of about 1 million. Which you add up the numbers involved, you get something like 2 or 2.5 million. Now, obviously, anybody getting 2.5 million must be in the capitalist class. You might say he gets fired, but getting 2.5 million at that point makes such a person wealthier than many people who have lots of capital. Usually what goes along with that, as we know, is that they give them quite a lot of shares. In fact, they have demanded shares. And it's normal for the chief executive officer of firms to get shares, plus a pension. So in other words, the capitalist class today has become somewhat different from what it was. Whereas before, as it were, in the 60s or 70s, you might have talked about wealthy families. Now you're talking about finance capital and top management, which is effectively being enfranchised in a way that it wasn't before. Well, you would expect it to have a slightly different viewpoint as a result. Exactly what, I'm not absolutely clear. I'm not able here to put one next to the other, as it were. So, let's say hereditary capital would tend to this rather than that. I'm not at all clear about it. Of course, if you look back in history, it was true that Ticktin and Krupp supported Hitler, but then they both ended up being victimized by Hitler, and they didn't go on supporting him. And not a great deal of the capitalist class in Nazi Germany, or before Nazi Germany, didn't support Hitler. So one can't simply make that equation. But I suppose what one can say is that insofar as you have an increasing number or increasing weight of finance capital in the capitalist class, it would tend to be more short-termist and much more worried about security, immediate security of their assets. Though again, that might be contradicted by if you look at the composition of the 35 people who supported the Conservative Party in the cuts in Britain, you'll see that very few of them came from finance capital. You had Marks and Spencer, Asda, retail stores, but very few came from finance capital. You didn't have Goldman Sachs, you didn't have Barclays Bank, you didn't have any banks supporting. Maybe they were afraid they might be boycotted. I don't know, because that was the first result. If you looked at the net, people said, "Oh, good, we've now got their names. Now we can boycott Marks and Spencer, or God knows what." But having said that, as I say, I'm not very clear about it. What I would say, though, is that there is a greater divergence now in the capitalist class than there was 30 years ago. In part because the Cold War has come to an end, and in part because its composition has changed. And I think the result then reflects itself in the policy which is actually adopted. Let's say, on the one hand, it appears as if there is a single policy of cutting expenditure. On the other hand, there's enough opposition within the capitalist class or within the newspapers who reflect the capitalist class or within governments and political institutions to show that there is a divergence on it. So I'm not very clear about it. So I'm not able to identify one with the other. One can see what is dominant at the present time. All I'm saying here is that I think it's still to unfold. What goes with this is the fact they can't continue to use finance capital. It really has imploded. Well, it's obvious in Ireland that it has imploded. It can't be repeated here. It's not accidental that it happened in Ireland, of course, because effectively what actually happened was a shift of finance capital globally, and the main way the peripheral countries could participate was in finance capital. Since they weren't shifting to industrial capital, they weren't going to invest in so-called peripheral countries. It would be in terms of finance. So it's not accidental that it happened in Ireland or in Iceland. That would happen in Britain would obviously be the case because it had become effectively more than a junior partner to the United States in finance capital. After all, London had overtaken New York. That was no accident because, of course, under the Labour Party, they removed the controls which they did not remove in the United States. However, the essential point is that finance capital has imploded. They have had to introduce a whole series of rules which, to a limited degree, do contain it. It's no longer a strategy which is sufficient to contain the working class, as it were, or sufficient to maintain control over capitalism. That is why they have to have something else. And what I've been trying to say is the thing they have, which I think makes sense, is against Keynesism, but on the other hand, looked at in the medium to long term, I think is crazy, is such that you would expect them to have various groups within the capitalist class arguing for something else. I can't see what else there is. I don't think there is anything else. Which is why it does seem to me that this really is our time. In other words, the strategy which the ruling class is adopting, I think is crazy. It can't work. What you're likely to get in every country, including, I'm sure, here too, is an increasing militancy, because there is no alternative. No other alternative is being proposed. When Cameron says in Britain they will never go back to what existed, what's he proposing to most people? A horrible future. The curious thing about their strategy is that they're taking on everyone at once. We heard about divide and rule, but they're not dividing and ruling, they're just hitting everybody. Except themselves, of course. A so-called middle class, the working class, the unemployed, everybody on benefits, women, they're hitting everybody. They may produce propaganda which says something else, but that is what they're doing. Well, it's hard under those circumstances to avoid the conclusion that you're bound to get a militancy. However backward the working class might be, as it were, at any one time, it's bound to show itself as a class within the next few years. So what I've been arguing is that the capitalist class is itself divided. At the moment, it has accepted a particular strategy which I think can't possibly work, which in the medium to long term is crazy. But they're nonetheless divided. They're not very clear where they're going. And it's not really very clear, if you think about it, that even with their crazy strategy, if they think it'll work, that they really will manage to raise the rate of profit or make it stable. It is a structural crisis of capitalism. And finally, what I haven't done is gone through the, as it were, the fundamental contradiction within capitalism of the different aspects I mentioned. I don't think at the present time, as I said, that the falling rate of profit is crucial. I also don't think that it isn't possible in some time in the future that it be crucial, but at the moment I don't think it is. I would rule out the underconsumption as something which, in general terms, can always be avoided. So one's left then with disproportionality as an essential basis of it. Well, now, if you look at capital, you get all these aspects, let's say the different volumes of capital and there's surplus value. You get all these aspects discussed, including underconsumption. In fact, they all operate that over time. And Marx, I think, is saying that they all operate. But the question is, what is operating now? What's more important now? And what I'm basically saying is that during the period of the Cold War itself, military Keynesianism did actually sop up the surplus from Department 1. That has come to an end. What it does is leave an unstable capitalism which has to find a way out, which does end up with huge surpluses. You could say that there are 101 things that they could do. They could, but those are use values. We're talking now of values, exchange value. Of course they could go to the moon, or they could go to Alpha Centauri, or make everybody happy. But they aren't going to do that. That isn't capitalism. So what we're left with is the fact that there is nowhere to put the surplus from Department 1, other than to raise the standard of living, which they are not going to do. Which I effectively began by saying, they are not going to do that. So they are left with a surplus. Hence the shift to finance capital. Finance capital can no longer go on like that. But fairly obviously, you can't keep selling one particular derivative after another, two as it were, the same banker. It had to come to an end. So they are left with no real strategy in the end. This is a structural crisis of capitalism. It's also a crisis of strategy of capitalism, and of course it is a cyclical crisis. The cyclical crisis is effectively at an end in the sense that there's a weak upturn. The strategy of financial capital has imploded. They haven't found an alternative. They're trying to find an alternative. As I said, I don't think it can work. So the structural crisis of capitalism continues, whatever they do. I think that is where we are, and that is where capitalism is. And it is certainly a time for socialists to act. Thank you.